Please be seated. The court is now in session. Today, the chamber continues to hear the testimony of the witness at scene and commencing hearing testimony of a civil party through TCCP 244. Mr. Amhoy, please report the attendance of the parties and other individuals at today's proceedings. Grazie, Mr. President. For today's proceedings, all parties to discuss are present. Mr. Nunchi is present in the holding cell downstairs. He has waived his right to be present in the courtroom. The waiver has been delivered to the greffier. The witness who is to conclude his testimony today, namely Mr. Atsen, is present in the courtroom. We also have a reserved civil party, namely through TCCP 244. Thank you. President, thank you. The Chamber now decides on the request by Nuon Chea. The Chamber has received a waiver from Nuon Chea dated 8 September 2015, which notes that due to his health, headache, back pain, he cannot sit or concentrate for long, and in order to effectively participate in future hearings, he requests to waive his rights to participate in and be present at the 8 September 2015 hearing. Having seen the medical report of Nuon Chea by the duty doctor for the accused, the ECCC, dated 8 September 2015, who notes that Nuon Chea today has back pain when he sits for long and recommends that the Chamber grant him his request so that he can follow the proceedings remotely from the holding cell downstairs. Based on the above information and pursuant to Rule 81.5 of the ECCC internal rules, the Chamber grants Nuon Chea his request to follow today's proceedings remotely from the holding cell downstairs via audio-visual means. The Chamber instructs the AV unit personnel to link the proceedings to the room downstairs so that he can follow the proceedings. This applies to the whole day. The Chamber now hands the floor to the defense teams to put the questions to this witness. First, the floor is given to the co-counsel for Nuon Chea. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning. Good morning, Your Honors. Good morning, Counsel. Good morning, Mr. Witness. I would like to ask you some questions this morning. First, I would like to ask you a question about your family. Before the Khmer Rouge took over power in your village and in your district, did you have family living in Kampong Chnang, Pursat, Takiu, or Kampot?
No, I was only living in Ampel and in Per commune at the time.
Did you know at the time anything about Cham communities in those areas before the Khmer Rouge came?
My knowledge knowledge at the time was that the situation on the ground was normal before the arrival of the Khmer Rouge group.
But my question was, before they came, did you know anybody from Cham communities in those areas?
Man,
Yes, there were many people living in Ampel village at the time. Every house, there was many people living in each house in the village.
I think something went wrong with the translation, possibly. My question was, did you know anybody living in Kampong Chnang, Pursat, Takio, or Kampot? Any Cham living there?
nhóm đăng
I know there were many Cham living in Kampong Chnang, Kampot, and Battambong, but I never went to these provinces.
Very well, thank you. Mr. Witness, I'm not entirely clear as to which year you said the Khmer Rouge took over. Was it in 1971 or 1973?
It started in 1973. In fact, I was still attending the school in 72, but the school was closed down in 1973. At that time, the Islam schools and the Khmer schools were closed down.
From that period and the years before, did you know a man called Sosman?
No, I don't know anyone by the name of Sohman. Are you referring to Sohman or Sohmat?
I'm referring to someone who I think was the father of a person called Matli.
I know Matli. He works.
Let me start with the father of Matli. Do you know who the father of Matli was?
Matli worked in the unit in the East Zone, and Tokmat.
I will ask my questions maybe a little bit simpler. Do you remember the father of Matli?
what's gone
No, I don't. He did not live in Ampel village, so he might have lived in another village.
Do you know what the role was of Matli in the Khmer Rouge movement?
Matli was in charge of the army with the Tokmat at the time, and these two were usually together. Although I myself did not know his real position, but I usually saw Madley together with Tokmat.
Do you remember whether Madley at the time was encouraging people from Kampong Cham to join the revolution?
Yes, that is correct. He urged the people to enter the revolution.
Is it correct that Madley was a Cham himself?
Yes, he was a Cham person.
Yesterday, Mr. Witness, you spoke about measures taken by the Khmer Rouge as of 1973. You talked about the Cham people not being allowed to have prayers. Women's hair were cut. You weren't allowed to speak the Cham language. You were in fact forbidden to practice religion. Do you recall whether Madley was somehow involved in taking these measures?
From what I understood, he did not talk about that. I heard about the prohibition of practicing the religion, but it was not from him, it was from someone else. Personally, I did not hear him saying anything regarding the closure of the Islamic religion.
Who was it then that ordered these measures?
The order came from the upper level to the village chief and to the group chief. It was from the Angka above, so that the village chief and the group chief had to instruct us to stop practicing the religion.
Wasn't Madley himself in fact upper level?
President Witness, please hold on, and the Deputy Co-Prosecutor, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think counsel should ask a more specific question about his position. We know from his interview he was a member of a district committee. Some people might interpret that as upper level, some might not. So I think counsel should be more specific in his question.
I think we're always speaking, Mr. President, about upper level here, without ever feeling need to be specific. However, I will rephrase my question. Do you know the position of Madley, Mr. Witness?
I do not know his actual position. However, he was in charge of the East Zone along with Tokmat, and these two were always together.
គាត់
And he rarely came to Ampel village. He usually was at Dambai district and Tabong Khmum. He only came once in a while to stay in Ampel village.
Have you ever heard at a later stage, maybe, that Matli was appointed in 1976 as a member of the Standing Committee of the National Assembly?
Yes, I do. I know that he was a member of the National Assembly,
ថាគាត់តស៊ូ
as he was considered joining the resistance.
Let me move on. Mr. Witness, yesterday you spoke about demonstrations in 1973 or 1974 because of the measures that were taken against your religion. Is it correct that after these demonstrations you were arrested and detained at Krokchmar Security Center?
Yes, that is correct. I was in danger at the time. My cow became sick after the demonstration, so I slaughtered the cows, and as a result, I was arrested and detained at a prison in Krokchmar district. I was accused of killing an unsick cow.
How were you treated at Krokchmar Security Center? Were you beaten by prison personnel, for instance?
They did not beat me up or anything, but they had to carry out the investigation first, and if that was true, then I would be detained for a long time. I saw many inmates were tortured during their interrogations at a building behind the detention house, but my turn was not yet ready for that, as the investigation process was still underway.
Do you know whether Krokchmar Security Center was part of the district of Krokchmar, or whether it was part of the sector to which Krokchmar belonged?
It belongs to the Krokchmar district. It was a rather large house. It was a stories house, and just on the ground floor there were 4 levels where prisoners were detained, and both floors were fully crowded with inmates.
Do you recall to which sector Krokchmar belonged? What was the number of the sector to which this district that you lived in belonged?
Krokchmar district extended from Kampong Tre to Roka Canal. That was the area under the Krokchmar district, and if you were to make mistake, you would be arrested from these areas and detained at the Krokchmar detention center.
Let me assist you, because I don't have that much time, Mr. Witness. Was Krokchmar district part of region or sector, rather, 21?
Yes, I think so.
Do you know who, after the liberation in April 75, was the chief of Sector 21?
No, I don't. I don't know who was the chief at the time.
Does the name Chan ring a bell?
No, I cannot recall that name. I don't know where he lived or where he worked.
Do you know who was in charge in Sector 21 of economics, administration, education, and organization?
It was Comrade Singh from the Southwest Zone who was present there, and besides Singh, I do not know who else was in charge of these sections.
Maybe I will assist you a bit. Mr. Witness, have you ever heard of the name, somebody who was in charge as of these functions in July 75, someone with the name Uk Bun Chun?
I do not know Ok Bun Chun.
Have you ever heard of somebody with that name in a present-day context? Someone who is presently a senator, Uk Bun Chun?
No, Counsel, no, I don't.
Let me go back to the village level. Kop Sat, who was he?
Kop Sat was a village chief at the time, that is during the period of arrest. He was there as a village chief. He was the one that ordered us to eat pork. We understood that he received such an order from the upper level.
Was Kop Sat a Cham himself?
Yes, he was also a Cham person, but he actually was afraid of the upper level. And to my knowledge, not long after, he was arrested and killed.
Have you ever heard of someone with the name of Meng Hun?
Meng Hun worked for the security. However, to my understanding, not long after, he was arrested and put into a sack and thrown into a trap and drove away. I refer to a person by the name of Meng in the village, and he worked for the security.
Have you ever heard of a man named Les Kassem?
The name Lekasen does not ring a bell. Did he live in Ampel village or elsewhere?
That's a good question, Mr. Witness. I wanted to ask you that question. Let me now ask you a general question about the period 74-75. Do you know whether at that time a Cham movement existed? A movement which had as its intention to create a state within the state, a Cham state. Do you know anything about this?
No, I did not hear anything about that or any of such a rebellious nature.
Fulro Champa. Does that ring a bell? I'm not quite sure if it's translated properly. Yes, it is. Fulro Champa.
Nobody said anything about that. We, the Cham people, were afraid of saying anything about this because we were afraid that if we were to say it and it was heard, then we would be arrested and taken away.
Did you know at the time anybody who was active in a movement to create a Champa state within Cambodia?
President Judge Laverne, you had the floor first.
Yes, Council Koppel, for the record, could you please spell out the name of the movement you're speaking about? I heard Fulro Champa, but I'm not sure that I understood precisely what it's about.
Fulro, Fulro Champa.
Unless I'm mistaken, I believe the Fulro was something in relation with oppressed races, the United Front of Oppressed Races. Is that what you're referring to?
I'm happy to guide you where I have it from. E3/387, document E3/387. It's a statement of Uk Bun Chun, English ERN 00350206, French 00441419, and Khmer 003799487. This movement, I will quote, intended to create a state within the state because the Cham Muslims wished to occupy Cambodia territory on the eastern bank of the Mekong River to central Annam, to create a state. This was according to their confessions. They had an organization, Fulro Champa, under the leadership of Sabun Leskazen in Phnom Penh.
Excusez-moi,
I'm sorry, is Fulro an acronym or is it actually a name?
It is in his statement spelled in capital letters, Fulro.
So we may suppose in that case that it's an acronym.
If we would hear this particular individual as a witness here, then I'm sure he'd be able to explain if it was an acronym, yes or no. I don't know. I presume so. I don't know. So you haven't heard of Fulro Champa? That's correct, Mr. Witness?
President, please hold on, Mr. Witness. You may now proceed. International Deputy Co-Prosecutor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a couple of observations. I think counsel should be clear about the time period he's asking about. In response to your question to Judge Laverne, this was not some secret, covert thing going on during the Khmer Rouge. This was an open political organization, but it was in the pre-1975 time period. So he should be clear about what time period he's asking about. My understanding is that there was a Fulro Champa that was part of a political organization related to the Cham, and later on that became part of a broader organization relating to ethnic minorities called Fulro.
I think the prosecution is giving evidence. I'm just reading an excerpt from a statement of someone who was, in fact, as of July 75, Deputy Secretary of Sector 21. And he is referring to Fulro. So I think if it was an open organization, then possibly the witness would have heard of it. But I presume, Mr. Witness, that you haven't heard of it. I would like to ask you something about a second Cham movement called Kabal Sa. Have you ever heard of this?
Answer, no, I have never heard of it. I have never heard of it.
Let me ask you in general terms, in the period 73, 74, 75, have you ever heard of any quote-unquote rebellious Cham movement?
No, I have only heard the rebellion at Gokpal. Gokpal rebellion when the Cham people were fighting with the Khmer Rouge. It was the only incident that I heard.
Very well, let's move there. Yesterday you were asked questions about this rebellion in Gokpal. You yourself were not there, but you had an in-law who gave you information. Do you know anything about what caused the crackdown of that rebellion? What happened before Cham people were killed?
Answer, it happened a long time ago. I mean, the incident, we were prohibited from praying, from worship, from fasting. Villagers at Gokpal rose up and opposed to the prohibition by Khmer Rouge.
Have you ever heard the story that 28 Khmer Rouge cadres were chopped to death by local Cham people?
President, please hold on, Mr. Witness. You may now proceed. International Deputy Co-Prosecutor.
Well, counsel is leading the witness, and he's leading with a completely different account than I think every one of us have read about this incident. So if he's seized upon some misaccount of this, he at least should be quoting it so we know where this information is coming from. The accounts of this rebellion talk about one person soldier being attacked, not 28.
Let me not focus on 28. Have you ever heard, although I'm quite sure I read 28, Mr. Witness, have you ever heard of many Khmer Rouge cadres being chopped to death by charm?
Counsel, generally, can you provide for the benefit of the record the basis for the question? I think that's what the prosecutor asked.
The 28 is, I will get back to you, it's either coming from Keenan or Poncho. Cham people chopped a sub-district cadre to death is coming from Uk Bun Chun's statement. So I will be more general, and I will ask the witness whether he knows anything about killing of Khmer Rouge cadres by Cham in Kopal.
បាទខ្ញុំ
Answer. I did not witness the incident, but I have heard that soldiers were chopped to death in 1977. I do not know how many of them were chopped to death. My in-law also told me about that incident.
You just said 77, but do you in fact mean 1975?
Answer, yes, it was in 1975. It was actually before 1975, and in 1975, Cham people were evacuated because of the rebellion.
But what did your in-law tell you specifically about the killing of Khmer Rouge cadres on Kopal by Cham? How did this happen? Who was involved? How many people died?
Answer. I do not know for sure about the event. Cham people who had swords, who had knives were killed by Khmer Rouge at that time. Only these people were shot to death by Khmer Rouge soldiers. Other people who opposed Khmer Rouge at that time were not killed.
Let me move on to how the rebellion was cracked down. Do you know which forces were involved in the crackdown of the Kopal rebellion? Were these district forces or were these sector forces?
Answer. I do not know about that. The soldiers came from the districts. They were told to be ready to curb the rebellion at Kopal.
Have you heard of military forces with heavy artillery coming from the rubber plantations in the south, having different kinds of uniforms, carrying heavy weapons, and that they were involved in the cracking down of the Kopal rebellion?
Answer. I did not witness the incident. I heard that artilleries were put behind the Kapal village.
What do you remember about this artillery?
Answer. I could not recall. No shooting at that time, but I heard gunfire, and artilleries were put behind Kapal inside the village, and some of Cham people were tied up at that time.
But do you remember, or maybe your in-law remembered people, soldiers wearing military uniforms and carrying heavy artillery?
President, please hold on, Mr. Witness. You may now proceed. International Deputy Co-Prosecutor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Again, if counsel wants to try to refresh and use a document that talks about these soldiers in uniforms, he should reference the material, because I believe he's now mixing up the Kopal and the Svai Kling rebellions, two different events. He's shaking his head, but none of us would have to debate this if you would cite the document when you wish to put evidence to a witness.
I'm asking a general question to the witness, Mr. President, whether he remembers, or his in-law remembers, people wearing military uniforms, indicating that these would be regiment or sector forces rather than district forces.
Mr. President, counsel shouldn't be testifying about the significance of military uniforms. Again, if he has information he wishes to present to the court that's part of the record, he should cite it. He's leading here, he's testifying himself.
Again, I'm not testifying at all. I'm asking whether he knows anything about uniforms of the people of the military shooting with artillery. That's my question. Mr. Witness, do you remember anything about the soldiers being involved in the military attack on Kopal?
Answer. I saw boats arriving at Kapal, and I noticed there were also artilleries, and there were fire. There was fighting at that Kapal for a few days.
Do you have any knowledge of artillery? Do you know anything about how many millimeters mortars were at the time?
Answer. I do not know about that, Mr. Lawyer. I do not know how many mortars or artilleries.
Have you ever heard of Battalion 55 of the Sector 21 Regiment?
President, Mr. Cooper, Please repeat your last question. There was no proper translation of your questions.
I certainly will, Mr. President. Mr. Witness, have you ever heard of Battalion 55 of the Sector 21 Regiment?
Answer, I'm sorry, Counsel, I do not know.
I shall give you the name of one of its commanding officers, and I will ask you whether you know this name. Hun Sen, the present Prime Minister. Do you know him?
Answer, yes, I have heard of the name Hun Sen, but I did not know at that time where he was stationed. I only knew that he also joined the resistance in the jungle.
Have you ever heard whether he, as a commanding officer, was involved in the crackdown of the rebellion of Kopal?
Again, Mr. President, I have no objection to the question if it's based on something and not just council's theories or wishes. So if he wants to put this question, please cite the basis for it so we all know he shouldn't just be making things up in the courtroom.
Well, the basis is actually someone who worked with the prosecution for quite a while. But I think I'm entitled to ask that question, Mr. President, whether the witness knows whether commanding officer Hun Sen was involved.
President, Mr. Cooper, please provide the basis or the documents that you quoted, in particular the documents which were admitted to be used before the chamber. Otherwise, the chamber will prohibit the witness from answering to your question.
If you insist, Mr. President, of course I will provide you the basis of my questions. It is E347.3, English ERN 010860027, which describes indeed the attack on Svay Kling and Kopal, and the position which is being put forward there is that the attack was done by Battalion 55, led by Commanding Officer Hun Sen. And I'm trying to establish whether the crackdown was done by the region or rather by the district. So that's what I'm trying to get at.
Mr. Kopek, can you repeat the reference? I'm sorry. Pardon. Est-ce que vous pouvez...
please, can you repeat the references? I'm sorry, I didn't have the time to note them down properly. I heard E347.3.
That is correct. E 347, so not E3 slash, but E347.3. It is a Human Rights Watch report on page 20. English ERN, as I said, 010860027. The attack on Sveikling and Kopal is being described as executed by Battalion 55 of Sector 21. So that's where I have my information from.
Council Koppe, are you maybe aware of a decision from the chamber regarding this document?
No.
Which
Are you sure? There never was a request to put this document before the chamber, and the chamber never ruled on that request? Are you sure?
I think the Qs and PAN team did, that's why I know we didn't, but the Qs and PAN team filed a request.
bien.
Well, then, Council Koppe, it seems that human rights report, at least that segment, has not been put on the case file.
Well, again, as in other situations, you made me explain where my knowledge is coming from. I was asking questions about which military forces were involved in Kopal, and it seems that it was the forces led by the present Prime Minister who were involved. And the information is coming from Steve Hedder, which is, I'm sure, the author of this report, and who worked for the prosecution for quite a while.
We heard an impassioned speech yesterday about how people need to rely on the investigation. This rebellion was investigated. I've been searching for references to Battalion 55, and if there's a basis for the question, that's fine, but Council should move this document into evidence if he thinks it's reliable. It's a Human Rights Watch report. Human Rights Watch obviously was not at Kopal in 1975, so the real issue is what is the source of this information. And when Council tries to present matters in this way and stand up in this courtroom and assert something as a fact when there's nothing in the investigation about it and it comes from a document that's not been put in evidence, these proceedings are distorted. So we would have no objection if they move this into evidence, but we need to know what the actual source of this evidence is if this proceeding is going to be meaningful.
As I said, the actual source is someone who's considered an expert for this court, who didn't testify as an expert but as a witness, and who was someone who was involved in the investigation for a long time. And I have knowledge that, in fact, Steve Hedder is the author of this report, and he is making the argument that it was, in fact, Battalion 55 that was involved.
Mr. President, I'm pretty sure Steve Hedder was not at Kopal in 1975. So again, the issue is what is the source of this? I'm looking to see if Steve Hedder's name is in this. I'm looking for sources, but the reason I'm having to look now and we have to interrupt this proceeding is because Council hasn't put this evidence properly before us. So I'm here in the position of having to search this document. So I think it's entirely improper the way Council brings these matters before the court.
President, legal lawyers, I noticed that you are on your feet. Do you have anything to address the chamber?
Thank you, Mr. President. What I would like to specify is that this document is not part of the case file. That is the issue. So the point is not whether we're speaking about Hun Sen or not. Here today we see once again the Nunchia defense is using again a document that is not in the case file, and the Kyo Sompo defense tried to have this document admitted according to proper procedural rules, and this document was dismissed by the chamber. That's the issue. The issue is not whom we are speaking about, but about how this document is used by the defense, whereas the defense knows perfectly well that this document has not been put onto the case file nor admitted.
President, you may now proceed, Judge Lamenya.
Yes, for the purposes of the record and for Victor Kupper's information, the memo is E347/1. That's the index. And the relevant segment is Chapter 2 of the Human Rights Watch report, in particular paragraphs 3, 4, and 5, 6, 7, and 8.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour à tous.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you. Good morning to all of you. I have a request for clarification because I believe I understood the previous decisions, including in case 02/1, that the issue of when we were faced with this issue of where the document comes from, but since the document is not presented, we felt that we had the liberty of putting all questions that are necessary. So I don't know why suddenly that each question put by the defense has to be based on a specific document. Why, if we do not intend to confront the witness with a particular document, why do we have to base all of our questions on a document? This is a request for clarification because the co-prosecutor's position does not seem to be in relation with the Chamber's jurisprudence regarding this matter.
If I may respond, the reason is you're leading the witness if you don't have some basis. You can't just stand up in court and make an assertion that Hun Sen was part of an attack without some evidence. And I'm reading this now. There is no cited evidence here. There's a unspecified interview by an academic without even identifying the source. So for counsel to stand up here and make these assertions without a proper evidentiary record, he's leading the witness. Yesterday, both of you stood up and objected when I asked this witness how many Cham people lived in his own district. Now you want him to be an expert on the entire structure of the East Zone.
It's a pathetic and shameful attempt to cut the defense off of trying to find out what really...
President Council Copper, you will have the last say on this matter, and now the floor is given to the lawyer for civil parties. Trisina, thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to make an observation on this matter. In fact, we, the civil parties, have put questions to civil parties or witnesses, and usually the defense teams would rise and demand the sources that we quote in those questions. And to play a fair game, I believe both sides have to refer to the sources that you extracted or that you relate them to your questions to the witness. Thank you.
On the record, Mr. President, what's happening here is an attempt to avoid evidence which might incriminate present government members as the perpetrators of the actual genocides, if there were any in 75. So I think it is perfectly appropriate to find out what happened in 75, especially in Tra village, which is about to follow. The defense is perfectly entitled to find out what happened in 75 and whether Uk Boon Chun and Hun Sen were involved in the killings.
I'm sorry to rise again, but I cannot let that be unresponded to. No one here is trying to do that. You are perfectly entitled to pursue that. You need to do it by proper evidentiary means. You cannot just make up things in the courtroom. So feel free to prove that. We have no objection. You need to do it by proper means of evidence, Mr. President. That's our position, not that he should be precluded from doing this.
As said, it's Steve Hedder who's implying this, and you know him very well.
There's nothing about Steve Hedder in this document. He's making that up.
President Judge Vance, you have the floor.
Well, it cannot come as a great surprise. I mean, this is how criminal proceedings work. If you want to confront the party with something, if you put forward an allegation, you have to cite the basis for this. If the basis is a document which hasn't been admitted during proceedings or actually specifically rejected, as in this case, find another basis or move on.
And that's exactly what I didn't do, because I know this is going to happen in this court, trying to hide the truth of what really happened.
President, Counsel, you have to follow the standing practice and procedures in this courtroom, so please move on.
Something I would, of course, do in any other court, Mr. President, but I'll move on. Mr. Witness, do you know how many people were killed at Kopal and Svay Kling?
No, I do not know how many people were killed. I knew people were killed, but not the number of those who killed.
Is it correct that hundreds of Cham were massacred by East Zone forces?
As I said, people were killed, but I did not know how many, as at the time I was hiding in a house in Ampel village.
There was another massacre in 75, wasn't there, in Tra village? Is that correct?
Then the Deputy Co-Prosecutor, you have the floor.
Again, counsel is leading, and again, I think he's got his information mixed up. There was another incident in Svay Kling in 75. In Tria, it was 1978. If he has some other information, he should be specific. He shouldn't stand up and lead the witness with incorrect information.
At least read your sources, Mr. Prosecutor. I have it from Kiernan, who's quoting Poncho, describing a massacre which was executed in pretty much the same way as described yesterday by this witness in November 75. I'd be happy to read it for you. Poncho adds that in November 75, Chams in Tree village of Crouchmar also rebelled. Then the Khmer Rouge tore the village apart with B-40s and smashed the heads of any survivors with pick handles. The corpses were thrown aside and left. They even stuck heads on pikes and exposed them along the banks of the Mekong. Poncho, page 153. So I'm trying to figure out whether this massacre in Tree that the witness described yesterday wasn't actually in 78, but rather in 75.
Mr. President, I have no objection. Again, he should read the document first, ask the witness if he's familiar with an event in Tria Village in 1975, but he shouldn't stand up and suggest that what he just read is in any way similar to what the witness described as happening in 1978 in Tria Village. They're completely different. So he shouldn't be characterizing and leading. If he wants to present and ask about what happened in Tria in 1975, go ahead.
Fine. Mr. Witness, do you know whether there was a massacre of Cham being killed, thrown in the river in 75 November?
No, it was not in 1975. 75 was a year that villagers were evacuated from villages.
We know for a fact that this French person that I was referring to, François Poncho, wrote his book in 76. So at the time he didn't know what was going to happen later. So I think we can be convinced that it was in 75. Have you never heard any stories about the cruelties that I just described?
Again, counsel is leading. He's misstating the evidence. This witness has described one event that took place in Tria in 1978. This book describes a completely different event in 1975. And he shouldn't be leading and trying to mischaracterize the evidence when he's asking questions here. This is utter deceit.
President, in order for us to proceed, the Deputy Co-Prosecutor, please provide your grounds for your objection so that we can use it as the basis for our ruling. For example, whether there was no citation in the questions or whether it was a leading question, for example. And if your objection is not based on any firm ground, I think it's just back and forth between the two sides. We as the bench would like to facilitate the proceedings and to issue our ruling based on the grounds that the parties provide to the chamber in order to proceed in an expeditious manner. And you all have been in this courtroom and involved in the proceedings for so many years already, so please try to avoid the relapse of this lack of grounds.
Thank you, Mr. President. The ground is that counsel is leading the witness. He's leading and suggesting to him that event in 1978 was the same as a different event in 1975. That is a leading question.
I don't think it was a question. It was a possible theory that this witness might be very afraid of telling what happened in Tra Village in 75 and rather shifts it to 78. But my question, a very factual question, was whether he knows anything of mass atrocities which are in certain details quite similar as to what he described yesterday. That's my question. Does he know of any mass atrocities in November 75 in Tra Village?
Counsel, I don't understand your question at all. President, witness, you do not need to answer a question that you don't understand. Let me take a short break and resume at 10:30. And court officer, please assist the witness at the waiting room for witnesses and civil parties during the break, and invite him back into the courtroom at 10:30. The court is now in recess.
Sure.